he's an award-winning documentary maker and writes regularly on climate change. He's the author of 2 books, Carbon Detox, and also, oh, where did I put it? I was going to, oh, here it is. Snap. This is, yeah.
Except that's the wrong way around.
George's previous book, which I heartily recommend. It's a very good read and digestible and is very easy to digest, although it's got a lot of very useful information in it. So I recommend that book. So anyway, without further ado, over to you, George.
Thank you, Charles. And if anything goes wrong with the volume, well, Carol, you can tell me because you're only one door away there. Thanks so much for having me. I really loved working with you when I was over here last time with the book, and really nice to meet you again. As you know, we have or as you may know, we have a really good climate change psychology network in the UK as well, and I've been involved with that since the outset. I mean, starting really, I mean, what I want to talk about, well, let's put the main thing up first. The operating title for my new book is What Happens Next? And what I mean by that, by the way, that's not necessarily the title we end up with, is what happens when climate change really starts barreling down on top of us? How are we going to respond? There's a range of ways that we could respond, but what do we know from the literature of psychology or past human experience that tells us how we will respond? And it's not going to be a one thing or another, it's going to be a range of different options. And I'd like to unpack that. One of the things when I wrote, I think for some reason it's coming out reverse on your screen, but don't even think about it. I explored the literature, and I talk with a wide range of people on our psychological response to climate change. And the first thing that was clear was that it's complex. Climate change is inherently challenging for us, and it's not that straightforward and not that rational. That rationally we should, for the past 30 years, have responded to this threat in a very straightforward way, which was in proportion to the scale and urgency of the threat. We should have said, right, this is really important, but if we take action now, we can avert future consequences. But we didn't, and there was a range of reasons why we didn't. As Daniel Kahneman, who's one of the people I interviewed in the book, who's as you know, is really the kind of founding father of cognitive bias study, says climate change is a bad combination of things for us. It's in the future, it's not here, and now it's in the future. It involves costs, there are uncertainties, and these are all things that tend to lead us towards delaying action. And I'm afraid that has been the case. I mean, we've delayed action for a generation now. Well, we're picking up now, but crikey, we're moving slowly. Now, of course, once climate change starts hitting, we're in a different. So there's a message for you, Carol. Did you see that? Libby Skills.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I'm just replying. Thank you.
Once, but now we're in a situation where those avoidance strategies, those defense strategies, but it's not here and now, it's uncertain, becoming less tenable. Still, people hold on to them because people shape their sense of climate change through the lens of worldview and their own cultural bias. So there are still people who wish to hold on to that, but we're seeing a big shift in terms of the opinion research. People more and more are saying, no, it is here. I mean, we've been one of the big shifts of the past 5 years. In every country, the large proportion of people says it's happening now. That's a big change. Whether they feel personally affected, well, that's still holding off. I mean, there's still a very strong tendency for people to distance the impact, to say, well, it's going to have a bigger effect on other countries or on other people than themselves. Only minorities of people, for example, in Australia, think it's going to seriously affect them personally. That will change with time. So The question is, though, whether there are new forms of avoidance, denial, which will start to come into play now. And the challenge of a book is to say, how might we respond to climate change in, let us say, 50 years' time? There's certain assumptions built into this question. I think the first assumption is that we are not going to suddenly turn this around. I am staggered and disturbed by the dominant narrative which emerges from the IPCC when the scientists talk about this, and from the climate negotiations, which is basically unchanged, has been unchanged for the past 30 years, which is to say, yes, this is very serious, but we're not yet out of time. If we all pull together and we all take action now, we can still achieve our targets. Well, we're not going to achieve 1.5 degrees. It's not going to happen, because when you look at the curve, we're up there. The only possible way of reaching 1.5, it's almost like falling off a cliff. It would be like sort of global economic collapse. It's not going to happen. I will get some expert opinion for the benefit of a book, but I don't think we're going to reach 2 degrees either. I think, as I said in Don't Even Think About It, the opinion of a scientist I spoke to was that we were ultimately heading for 4. And I think that's the case, I'm afraid. So it's an interesting form of futurology, because normally futurology is saying what will happen in the future. What I'm going to say is, well, we know what's going to happen in the future. I'm not even in this book going to talk about climate impacts other than to outline them. We know what the impacts are going to be. What interests me is in how are we going to respond to that? Now, one of the other operating principles on this, and sort of like underlying thinking on this, is that so far, a lot of the models for what climate change will be have made psychological assumptions. So when the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, puts out its climate change scenarios, those are all predicated on the assumption of a rational response. There's nothing in there which is completely weird or bizarre or disturbed or defensive, as we know humans are very capable of doing. They're all varying degrees of rational response. We either move slowly or we move faster. And I think we have to challenge that assumption. And part of the aim of the book is to say, well, actually, there's a range of scenarios, and they are much more complex than that. I guess the third operating thing, and I think this is really important, is to say that we can make mistakes if we assume that climate change is an issue similar to other major threatening issues we've faced, and that therefore we can safely predict what human responses will be, because it's not like other issues. The primary source of difference is that this is not restorative. You know, one of the things I talked about in my book is that we see and shape the world through the form of socially constructive narratives. The narratives which have dominated human culture and exist spontaneously across multiple cultures, in other words, they're inherent to our psychology, the way that we see the world, is one of a challenge. We face a challenge, we face an enemy, we face a threat. That threat is a big fight. We take on that threat, maybe we have external help, we overcome the threat, and we restore the status quo. And in the course of doing that, we learn some lessons, but we also reaffirm the cultural values. And this is a story which would appear in, whether you're looking at Grimm's fairy tales, whether you're looking at the Aeneid, or whether you're looking at indigenous cultures. This is a story which repeats itself. Now, the problem with climate change is that climate change does not have a restorative component. Climate change is going to be very different. It's going to be a very different circumstance. We are culturally wired to situations where we face enormous obstacles, we overcome them, and we rebuild, we restore who we are. And there isn't a single major issue that we have faced. Well, please challenge any of this, by the way, and tell me that there is. But I don't think there's been a single major threat that we have faced as humans that we have not had that option on. So, for example, Warsaw, the capital of Poland, was completely flattened by Nazi bombing. They rebuilt it. They rebuilt it stone for stone, the same as it was. I mean, it's a mock-up. but it was rebuilt. You know, human societies can face enormous suffering. Yeah, Ukraine, for example, in the Holodomor, 4 million Ukrainians were starved by Stalin's agricultural collectivization program. That is an enormous level of suffering. But then there's new children, there's new generations. You rebuild. Ukraine was looking in fairly healthy shape until recently. Now they're facing an enormous, overwhelming suffering, but they can still hold on to a narrative that they will go through this, they will fight this, but there's the possibility at some point down the line for restoration and renewal. But climate change is not like that. Climate change is going to be a situation, I think, where we're looking at something with steady, continuous, for the foreseeable future worsening. And it's not clear where the end is. And I think that brings into play a different set of psychological responses. Now, there may be some technological techno-fix which comes in, which allows us to suck stuff out of the air and allows us to kind of somehow to restore things and put them back. And it's very interesting that a lot is being invested in that story, because of course that's the story that we hold on to in our culture. Enormous amounts of money being put into the analysis of carbon capture and storage, or removal from the air. The IPCC, their predictions for achieving 1.5 degrees have built into all kinds of assumptions of technologies that don't exist. And I think we should call this what it is. It's a narrative. It's a story. It's a mythological story. Now, that's not to say it's not possible, but that's what it is. It's a story which is applied as a form of psychological defense. And I said in my book that carbon capture and storage was a story, and it had to be seen as such. It's a technology, it's an engineering solution, but it's a story because it exists so that the people who are utterly culturally and economically invested in fossil fuel production can say, we can keep doing this because of this thing over here. And they pump just about enough money into this thing in order to keep it alive and existing in their narrative. Similar, I think, with a lot of these things. So let's call out the truth. I don't think that's going to happen, and therefore, what we're facing with here is not something that can be overcome. There's still, by the way, there's still talking about stories. There's still a lot of people who talk about overcoming climate change, or winning against climate change, or Boris Johnson, who's a fool by any measure, but he's a storytelling fool. Recently did a speech in which he talked about how we were going to defeat climate change because he fancies himself as some kind of Winston Churchill character, but it's not. Actually, the analogy, if anything, is towards a degenerative disease, something which continues in its iterations to become worse. And if it's in Ukraine, it's not a matter of like overcoming the fight and then having some resolution to the war. It's like a situation where these bombs are going to keep dropping and dropping and dropping, and then there's more, and then there's more, and then there's more. So these climate impacts are going to be coming in again and again and again and more so. I'm sorry, I'm not aiming with this to depress you. I'm just pointing out, I think this is a reality of the science. And the interesting question for us is, how psychologically do people respond under conditions of constant, maintained deterioration, where looking ahead, they cannot see the end of it. So let me just cover some of the ground on this. I want in this book, therefore, to answer these questions, to go far beyond the bounds of the normal climate psychology or normal climate thinking, and recognize there's a whole body of research and understanding out there that might answer these questions. I'm very interested in how humans respond individually or collectively to sustained and non-negotiable impact. Something where you can't see an end, you can't see a solution, it just keeps happening, and how human nature behaves under those circumstances. And we know it can be competitive, it can be collaborative, there's lots of ways that people respond. I'm interested, for example, in how individuals respond for terminal illnesses. I think there's a lot to be learned from the psychology of palliative care, for example. The different phases that people go through when they face the inevitability. I have already raised in Don't Even Think About It the the analogues between climate change and responses to climate change and mortality fear, which I keep flagging up whenever I get a chance to speak to psychologists, is an enormously undeveloped area of exploration, because I think there's a lot of similarities there. And as I said, everybody I spoke to, including Professor Kahneman, said, yeah, that's a pretty obvious one. Someone should look at that, and no one has. So I want to go deeper into that and say, well, what is it when you see the inevitable destruction of everything? Now, maybe you believe, that mortality isn't the end of everything, but for a lot of people, they do. So when you're looking death in the face, when you're looking beyond that, how do you respond to that? I'm interested historically in how we've responded to situations like this. I think there's a great deal of lessons in history. And I'm interested in things like addiction and how addictive response is. And from like my initial conversations and reading, I've tried to draw up a set of potential scenarios for how we might respond to climate change. I'd like to share those with you. Then what I'd love to do is I'd love to have your responses and your feedback. Tell me I'm completely offline. Tell me any ideas, anything you have, because this is a wonderful opportunity to get the wisdom which is in our virtual room. So I've got nine scenarios, and in the book, what I was thinking would be very interesting to do would be at the kind of frontispiece for each one to write a little monologue, to have somebody talking about what it's like to inhabit that scenario. Because the important thing about the scenarios is these are states of mind. Again, I go back to the point, we know what climate change will be like, or what the impacts will be. We don't know, however, the mind frame that people hold. And the important things about these different mindsets is they're completely self-justifying. We know that humans create these self-sustaining worldviews, and then they do an assimilation bias where they start bringing in the information or the storylines or restricting their social circles and the information they receive from the outside world in order to sustain that worldview. So these are self-maintaining. I'm so sorry. I'm getting a tweet, and I'm wondering if in any way that's related to anything I'm doing. Let me just see. No, I'm not. So let me run through some of these thoughts. First, the first option here is cooperation. Humans are highly cooperative, like the world is built out of cooperation. So facing a deteriorating condition of the kind that climate change is, we cooperate. We achieve our greater self. We may, in fact, actually really develop as a human species. We may move forward and find new ways of being and cooperation. And we're living in a very different and interconnected world. And that may be part of that. So we look at this, we go, shit, we've got a problem. What are we going to do? Let's all pull together. Let's adapt as best we can. Let's reduce emissions. Let's cope with this as best we can. There's going to be some damage, but we can pull together. We're not going to be able to stop climate change, but we might be able to halt it or halt the progression of it, and then deal the best that we can with that. And we need to move fast. Okay, that's number one. So we like that one. That's the one we want. And I think it's important we map out the others to realize that that's something precious, but is not to be taken for granted. And that is the one on which so many of the scientific and political models, as I said, are predicated on the assumption of that first one. And there's a lot of experience in human, there's a lot in human experience which shows that's what people do. Or rather, that's what people do when they face a single challenge. So like Rebecca Solnit wrote a wonderful book, for example, talking about how during earthquakes or during major climate disasters, people pull together. And we can see that happening in Lismore now, the first time, maybe the second time. The question is, when you're in a situation where, the bombs keep dropping, or it just goes on and on and on, as far as you can see into the future, that doesn't stop. I wonder if people are so cooperative. But let's just hold for a moment that people cooperate and we come together. And we find new ways of being. Right, that's number one. Number two would be what I call invention. That's a scenario where we think our way out of it. We don't just cooperate and find maybe new ways of being, but we pull in our our inventive skills, our technical skills. That might be the one where we find ways of sucking stuff out of the air. The invention response is an elite response, by the way. It's one which requires and justifies a continuation of technical elites, capitalism, most likely. It's a status quo argument. And many of my friends, even my strongly left-leaning friends, are somewhat resigned to the fact that maybe the only way we can dig our way out of climate change is to continue with the kind of corporatist capitalism, which has got us into this mess. So that the invention one, you know, or all of the big, you know, all of the Google guys and Elon Musk and Bezos and all of these people love this one. Again, it's a narrative, remember, but maybe we can respond that way. And maybe the way we respond to climate change is we have, you know, we're all living in like air-conditioned bubbles, and, you know, it's an adaptation through technology. And remember, it's elite, because it just, I'm afraid the collateral damage of invention is probably a lot of poor people die. And there's an interesting psychological response by way to how do we respond psychologically to our sense of responsibility for the people who suffer in the course of the action we choose to take, which is like the kind of the climate and the psychological collateral damage. The third one, these aren't, by the way, necessarily in final order, I call distraction. Distraction is a response where actually we don't deal with it at all. And that I find interesting. Now, again, there's plenty of evidence that people in the past have responded in that way. I mean, just one simple one was the way that under the worsening conditions in apartheid South Africa, that sport became like a national cult. That people invested huge amounts of attention and effort and focus into sport as a way to avoid what was going on. Stanley Cohen in States of Denial, a book which had a lot of influence on me, talked in detail about that. But I'm also keenly aware of these little things. And this is just the beginning, mind you. These are tools of distraction, not tools of destruction, tools of distraction, where billions of dollars are going into psychologically grounded research into how to distract people. And remember, the big internet people, the big internet companies, their commodity is your attention. That's what they're fighting for, is attention. And they're going to do everything they can to get your attention and to hold it. And I think as older people, those of us on the call that I can see are mostly older, we don't recognize quite what is happening to younger people, especially children, with this. It may not be as bad as we think, but nonetheless. So there's distraction. I think distraction is one, right? Number 3. Number 4, responses of schism and blame. Blame, people responding through blame of saying they're the ones who caused this problem. Now that might be an intergenerational one. I think that's going to be very powerful potentially. That might be an inter-country one. It might be a class response. It's a very powerful and compelling narrative, which then has implications for politics, for how people respond. It's an angry response. Like if we were to say kind of like Kubler-Ross, we could say, well, there's denial, there's anger. And an angry response is to say you're to blame and to fight it out. Of course, it doesn't solve climate change necessarily. You know, none of these do. Well, I'm now in the area of things which don't actually really deal with climate change, but are psychological responses. So I think schism and blame is an interesting one. And I think that we could see stuff also that is also related to things like climate wars as well, where like over water wars, where water is diminishing. Yes, that's a climate change impact, but there's a psychological component, which is people respond to the climate change impact, not through cooperation or through invention, but through war. And I think that's definitely a possibility. Number 5, and I think this is where it gets really interesting, is scapegoating. Now, there's a lot of historical experience with how people have responded to insecurity and through crisis by scapegoating another group. It's, you know, in the shorthand I feel is how you're going to respond to climate change, shoot the gypsies. They haven't caused climate change, but you know what? They're weak, we're strong, we're going to shoot them. I mean, the Holocaust is in many ways like a response to a national crisis of insecurity. It's a psychological response. Now, a very interesting thing, and I think there's a lot of literature here which I haven't yet uncovered, but one of the things which started me thinking about this was a paper that was talking about how the 17th century witch hunts were directly related to climate change. I mean, directly related, that the waves of climate change in what we now call the Little Ice Age, this medieval cold period, which was a form of climate change. It was caused by volcanic eruptions, solar cycles, mixed actually with deforestation was a major cause of it. But Europe got very, very cold in these years. And but with each wave of this, there was an intensification of witch hunts. And in Germany, where these things were very intense, they actually created the witch hunts were specifically for what they called Wettermacherei, which was a term called weather magic. The idea that the witches, and in consort with the devil, were changing the weather. And we just go, oh, that's just medieval. But of course it isn't, it's deeply human. And I would say that there's plenty of room for new aberrant forms of scapegoating around climate change. Powerlessness and picking on the powerless, blaming the victims, we're very, very good at that as humans. And I think that blaming the victims is entirely possible here. Imagine, for example, a situation where there is mass migration around climate change. Look at how readily human society could turn against those people and somehow blame them as we feel the burden of the guilt for what we've done. Number 6, doubling down. Doubling down is an aberrant, is a form of reactive denial which is common for addictive behaviors. And that's why I guess addictive behaviors are so interesting. When you're presented with the evidence for what you have invested in is wrong, you do not, or damaging or destructive, you do not face up to the reality of that. You intensify the behaviors that are destructive. And so again, I'm in the book, I'll be drawing together all of the evidence for this, but there's an awful lot of that. I'm very interested also in the reflection of how that can behave, how that can manifest through groupthink. I'm interested in the Aberdeen paradox, for example, where entire societies can do things where individually the people don't believe in what they're doing, but collectively, because they think everybody else is doing it, they will support it. I mean, in a way, climate change could be a bit like that. But I think plenty of opportunity and plenty of experience in the political domain of where politicians have done things which are wrong, and what they do is they just simply do more of it. As I said, people who are alcoholics respond to the challenge that they're alcoholics by drinking more to show that because they can drink more, they're clearly not alcoholics. So I think there might be a lot of manifestation of that. So I can imagine, for example, that high carbon behaviors could become fetishized as a form of expression, or form of rebellion, or whatever we might call it. Number 7, religiosity. Religiosity could be in the form of existing religions. I mean, there's overwhelming experience, certainly for the past 2,000 years, of how a kind of intensified religion and religious experience. I'm saying religion here as opposed maybe to spiritual. I think spiritual would fall under cooperation, but religion in the sense of organized mass movements of people around a very intensively asserted shared set of values is a response. And I call it religiosity, but I would also call political movements, intense political revolutionary movements, political movements, a form of religiosity. Again, they're not dealing with climate change, they are psychological responses to it. And I think that's what makes them interesting and makes them potentially dangerous. So one obvious thing I would say is I would definitely predict that responses to climate change could involve an intensification of existing religions, and maybe extreme forms of existing religions, maybe new religions, but maybe other forms of expression of the same religious imperative, of something greater than yourself. And of course, spilling out of that, there's also a possibility for for extreme charismatic leadership as well, which I think is also part of that religious experience, like looking up to an iconic leader figure who is going to lead us out of who's going to lead us out of the wilderness, who is going to save us. I think is part of that religious expression. And the final one, number 8, is despair. And I think there's a lot of, I'm interested in the solastalgia and Glenn Albrecht's work. I think he's University of Queensland, right? Of looking at that kind of like sense of despair. I'm interested in exploring what despair looks like when it's both individually and across societies, and how that manifests. I'm interested, for example, in the sense of learned helplessness. That under repeated burdens and repeated blows, people might actually just buckle and just curl up into a ball and just give up hope and say, I'm not going to deal with it. I've kept the 9th one as just a question mark, something that we don't know, we can't know, both positive or negative, something which is, I think climate change is a transformative moment in the human experience. So I think let's keep the door open to the possibility of something completely unexpected. Like, who could possibly have predicted, 10,000 years ago, that these little bands of hunter-gatherers could live in downtown Melbourne, or even build downtown Melbourne? Who would possibly have thought that? So let's recognize humans are capable of amazing things, both destructive and constructive. So let's keep that question mark there. And I guess before we go into the discussion, I'm staggered by my capacity to speak. So I'm going to stop. I'm not suggesting it's either or for any of these. I think these are manifest already in various shapes and forms. And I think part of what's going to be interesting is to identify the things that are already up and running. And this is a clever thing with futurology, of saying, look, here's the seed of this thing which is coming in the future. As I said, major things where they seem absolutely aberrant, like, say, the Holocaust, were already present in the 1920s and could have been seen and predicted clearly, and indeed present, 50, 100 years earlier. And I think that we can quite reasonably identify some things. I think COVID has some very interesting lessons for us, and certainly something that I love doing is getting deep into the analysis of COVID and saying, look, when COVID is the first time that since the Second World War, that huge international transboundary issue of threat, and we see how people respond. Generally speaking, people are collaborative, which is a good sign. But also we can see bunches of people break away in all of these forms I've shown here. But we're not going to have a situation where it is like you wouldn't put on money on any of these. These are all going to be running at different rates, in parallel, in different places at different times. But the overall objective is to try and mark out the landscape. And the ultimate objective is not to depress the hell out of people and just say, oh my God, we're just doomed, but to say, let's recognize that there's some things here we need to be very, very alert to. We want to have this positive, constructive outcome, but let's be very alert to the first glimmerings of these other responses and nip them in the bud. That's enough of me.
Okay, well, look, thanks very much indeed, George. That's very illuminating. Look, I think we might have to extend this, this session to 24 hours, if that's okay with you. No, seriously, we might have to go a little bit.
Yeah, and my apologies. This is the first time I've spoken to a group about this, so
no,
tighter each time you do it.
Look, I thought what I'd do is just respond for a few minutes, because I actually was going to say something else, but I thought I'd just respond to your points, George. But also, I just wanted to have a couple of reflections before as well. That I was so struck by what you said to me when we had a brief phone call this morning about bombs in Ukraine, and that really with time we're going to be getting bombed. We're not going to be literally, well, hopefully not literally getting bombed, but we've already been bombed this year. The poor people who've been flooded out. I mean, they've been bombed, and this bombing is going to get more and more severe. So I was very struck by that. The other thing that I've been struck by recently, and I just looked at it again today, is the IPCC second report, which concerns adaptation, and in which there's actually no mention whatsoever of psychological adaptation, which I find quite extraordinary, I must say.
Mm.
So look, shall I say some things, and you might want to respond to a few of them, George? So look, I suppose in terms of the categories you were talking about of what happens next, you know, cooperation is obviously an area that we're very interested in terms of the whole issue of sort of building resilience and connection between people and psychology for a safe climate. And this is obviously something that we're going to, you know, really needs to occur on a, well, in one view anyway, on a systemic basis, either via something like transformational resilience or deep adaptation or something like that, so that there really can be deep emotional resilience. The idea of distraction, I think, is a very important one, and it made me think of Sally Weintraub's most recent book about the psychological roots of the climate crisis and the whole split between the caring and uncaring side of the personality, and the uncaring side really feeling entitled, and entitled really, I suppose, to all these distractions really in a way. So they're sort of both, the distractions are both can represent entitlement, but also a sort of way of just defending against anxieties involved. The other thing is the schism and blame and scapegoating and doubling down brings us back to where PSC started, really, which was to do with about denial and all those defense mechanisms. I mean, and I suppose one could say from a psychological point of view that as the situation becomes more difficult, on the one hand, there hopefully will be more movement towards connection and resilience, but on the other hand, there's the big fear that much more primitive defenses will occur, like, well, the sort of things you're talking about of sort of splitting and projection, and that just leads to further difficult consequences. I mean, in terms of religiosity, it's an interesting thing as well, because I suppose it was one of the things when we were in PSC thinking a couple of years ago about our vision and our purpose, and we could never quite work out what our vision was, but it sort of, it was partly about climate, but it was partly, I think, about having almost a religious view, if you like, of our relationship to the earth. And I suppose that's a particular type of almost a religious spiritual approach, which is obviously one on the much more positive cooperative side of things. And in terms of despair, well, I guess that's, you know, that's a lot of what we deal with really is despair or grief. And we're obviously going to be in business for a very long time in terms of dealing with that. And you noted about the despair of children. I mean, that's certainly something that we're extremely aware of. And I suppose we really got into the business of trying to help people cope emotionally with their despair through working with activists and scientists who were really, you know, because they were so aware of the situation, were really feeling intense despair. And in our groups, we certainly hear a lot about that despair. I was talking the other day about one group where about half the people in the group really felt that humanity was doomed. And there's a good question as to what you can actually say to that, apart from, yes, look, that's quite a tenable point of view. So yes, so I guess and in our model, we sort of try and help people try and cope with the feelings really, and connect with others and become more resilient, and kind of through that develop more sense of hope as well. So I just wanted to say that as a few brief words. I don't know whether you wanted to respond to that at all, George. Or...
No, I'd like to hear from the people on the call.
Okay.
I'm very interested also, not in just having this as a kind of question and answer session, but in having the people on the call contribute your ideas. What I'd like you to do is, I mean, I've given a kind of in the initial framework, which you're welcome to challenge or question, but I'd also like you to be saying, what do you think is going to happen next? Like, you know, I mean, what would you put your money on if you're having a bet? And I think, you know, and how do we ensure that the outcome is the positive one? Yeah, open up to everybody.
Perhaps people could, if they want to speak, they could use the raise hand function or raise their hand. That might be the easiest thing to do. Yeah, Robert.
Hello, George. George, you came to Shepparton a few years ago, and that was wonderful. I appreciate that. George, the prevailing economic system is the root of the trouble. Like many things that can be considered the root of the trouble, but I think the prevailing economic system is one of those things. How do we overcome that? Like, how do we change? Like, the prevailing economic system encourages individualism, and you're saying cooperation is going to be one of the solutions. So until we can change the economic system, we've got little chance of reaching cooperation that you say we desperately need.
I don't feel, to be honest, within this conversation, I can answer questions of that kind. Unless we can feed it through this question of how will we respond. So I guess the question would be, could one of our responses be a response to change the economic system? I guess that would be the question, like, you know, what happens next? So do we, for example, see, you know, mass collective desire to change the economic system, and are we, you know, would we see movements for doing that? I guess that's the question. I'd say, I guess one of the things I'd like to do is to say, yeah, let's put that on the map. Let's say that is one of the possible outcomes. I think that could fall both under cooperation, and I think it could also potentially fall under schism and blame. I think that it may very well be that people see the current system as being to fault, and that therefore they seek to overthrow it. I mean, schism and blame isn't necessarily, I mean, although I've been critical about these, they're not necessarily bad things. I think to have major economic change requires a kind of anger. We know it hasn't changed before. We also know that that when we have had major revolutions and overthrown significant shifts, there's often been a price to pay for that because other things have kicked in. So maybe we need to be alert to that. Yeah.
George has argued that we don't have time to change anything much at all.
I'm not saying that. I mean, I'm open to all options. I'll say, if you want to know my personal view, no, I don't think we have time. I don't think we have time. I mean, we're talking, yeah. Well, yes and no. On the one hand, I don't think we have time. On the other hand, I know that historically, the times when astonishing economic transformation has been achieved have been times when there has been dictatorial takeover of the economy. Now, I don't like dictatorships, and I know enough, for example, about the Soviet experience to know that some truly, utterly horrible things came out of it. However, I also know that the Soviets were able to completely turn the economy around in an extremely powerful way. And war economies are always one of the models for us.
Yeah, many people
change, right?
Sorry, many people point to the beginning of World War II, when the US economy changed the way it did in almost overnight.
That's very true. That's what I'm saying, like war economies. That was a more democratic model, but it required a concentration of power, right? So if we're saying the economic model needs to change, then maybe the way it needs to change is towards a concentration of power. So I'm not advocating one way or the other. I'd like to keep it focused on one of the psychological responses. So one of the psychological responses might be that an overthrow of an overthrow of change of power, but that is not a response which I don't feel is particularly collaborative. I feel that's an angry response.
Okay, can we move on? Sally, you've got your hand up.
Hi there, and thanks, George. That's been a really interesting way of kind of sitting with our responses. And yeah, they don't quite feel like what's going to happen next. They feel very much like what is happening. And I think particularly recognising those narratives around the politics of schism and blame, scapegoating and doubling down, how much they certainly dominate our political life here in Australia at present. Just sort of noting some of these are very narrative, as you said, very much a narrative, a story, the cooperation, the invention. Some are kind of behavioural responses like the distraction or the doubling down. And I'm kind of interested in the narrative side of it very much because I agree it totally rules the way that we get up in the morning and face what we're facing. So I was thinking too about one narrative I see a lot of, I guess, which goes under several banners. One is regeneration. Another is a sense of, in some way, almost hospicing. There's the narrative that, yeah, we're probably not going to make it, or certainly not in the ways of living that we most know, but what we can do is do regenerative actions for the earth itself. So these earth practices, eco themes and so on. And some of that can also be related to a sort of form of symbolic immortality as a response to the coming death, what we can leave on the planet, whether the human race makes it or not, human species makes it or not, that we can make these kinds of differences. So it's not so much as I think the cooperation narrative is that we will make it through, as we can kind of do an atonement. So that I think in that way it links to religiosity by doing what we can to increase Earth's living systems that we have so destroyed. So I'm kind of interested in the way that narrative is certainly strong in alternative circles. There's a lot of films, books and so on coming up with this term regeneration. And yes, the hospice one I notice comes up quite a bit from the States, which is the sense of how do you have the good life in this limited amount of time. And again, in the sense of religiosity, I think, and atonement and so on. So those are just a couple of comments that came to me in listening to the narratives. And yeah, I think it would be great to have a sense within what you're writing for people to be able to both individually relate to what you're writing about, as well as to see it in the larger social movements and the complexity of all of it being there at once. I've got a husband here, John Marshall, another Marshall, who I think might want to say something too.
Does George want to respond?
Okay, yes, anything you wanted to respond to, George? It wasn't.
Yeah, I don't want to respond at length. I mean, thank you so much. I think these are really interesting. I just wanted kind of like a clarification that you say it's not cooperation. You say it's a kind of atonement. So basically, am I right then in thinking that this is in the sense I've been talking about a psychological response, but this isn't necessarily about dealing with climate change? This is, I mean, obviously some of it might be, there might be a kind of a carbon sequestering natural ecosystem thing, but it's about us responding in a way, I like this word atonement, I think it's really powerful, like responding in a way that we leave a legacy, or we protect something, or I just want to say, by the way, I'm very interested in all of these words like regeneration, restoration, rewilding is very big at the moment in Britain. And rewilding is a climate change response. It's both positive for climate change in the sense that it's a kind of an amelioration of climate change, but it's also an attempt to kind of like shift the moral balance of saying, well, we're doing this harm over here, so we're going to. I think there's a lot of interesting stuff which also happens with this idea of balancing impact. So you say, well, this is going to be destroyed, so we're going to enhance this, you know, of ecological offsets. You know, this is going to be mined, so we're going to restore this. So maybe that's something as well. Like, okay, so you know, so we lose the Amazon, but we're gonna, you know, we're gonna protect the.
Yeah, no, I wouldn't quite agree there, because I think the offsetting mentality is quite a different mentality, because that is a separating thing. Like, we can destroy this part of the world, but we can, you know, do this nice thing over here. Whereas I think the deeper drive around regeneration, it does pull a little a bit away from the climate change thing. Well, not away, but it's a bit larger because it is much less focused on carbon emissions, on the fact that we're heating through carbon emissions and fossil fuels, and it's coming at it from much more ecological consciousness, and looking at that whole sort of Western consciousness separation from nature and all the harms that have come from a distorted worldview and understanding. So
can I ask a quick question? I was interested also, you said at a hospice and you're saying like of like a good life in this period of time.
Yeah.
That's potentially very dangerous across an entire society, isn't it? I mean, if you had a situation with a whole society looking into the future and they're saying, well, we're not going to have long before this all just absolutely collapses, let's make the most of it. Could that not be a very hedonistic response and actually not a balanced or mindful response at all?
I think it can be both. I think there can be a split there. I mean, the hospice thing, I've seen a lot come from the States and for quite some time. And I think it's meant to be a very enlightened spiritual one, and that we will make good in our last days. We'll die consciously and so on. But yes, I think the shadow side of it is most definitely kind of a hedonistic one, and that comes out in a very different, and equally, you know, you can see it quite often coming up in social media and memes too. There's this kind of yeah, we're fucked, but we can have a great time till we go kind of.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
they can both be put under that particular theme, but they can have the shadow side is very different to the other one, and they both kind of need to be interrogated. The more mythic these narratives get, the more kind of shadowy that the problem can be. But yeah, I did want to differentiate the offset idea from a kind of a reclamation of ecological consciousness, and with it as sort of a sense of, as I said, that feeding into symbolic immortality by using one's agency here to actually increase the well-being and health of the greater ecology of which we ultimately are a part. So the kind of holistic one, yeah.
John, did you want to say?
Yeah. I mean, just to carry on a bit, I thought that the sort of hospice things I've seen is often people sort of seeming to delight in the deaths of millions or billions of people. You know, it will happen naturally and we'll all emerge into a new world. I've never seen that. But anyway, that's not what I'm talking about. I really liked what you said. I think it was really interesting and really to the point. But I was thinking, when you come to the first thing about how all of our stories are about sort of facing up to challenge and then, you know, overcoming the challenge, I was wondering whether you'd ever looked at Toynbee's work, because that's all phased in terms of challenge and response, and yet quite clearly you don't always succeed, right? So, you know, you do fail, but sometimes you fail gloriously, sometimes you fail in a sort of regenerative manner. But I mean, one of the things that he argued was that every success in facing a new challenge actually involved a new religion, which is kind of scary and interesting at the same time. And why I was thinking that might be the case is that because it's extremely difficult to conceptualize climate change or the ecology other than symbolically, because it's such a complex system, we can't possibly describe it in detail. We can't predict it in detail, you know, any more than you can predict the weather in detail. We certainly know that things will get worse, but how they will get worse, at what rate they will get worse, when particular cities will fall under the seas, we don't know, and we can't know. And so in this particular case, I would have thought the forces driving us towards a sort of symbolic religious response to try and conceptualize things would be incredibly strong, if that makes any sense.
I think that's fascinating. I'd like to let that just sit. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Catherine, do you want to speak?
Hi. At times of overwhelm, I tend to look for something that's growing and is effective. And I'm lucky enough to live in a semi-rural area. So I've just watched regenerative agriculture growing, and it seems to be a quiet revolution across Australia, and one that would be enhanced by a different economic model, but can certainly exist within the current economic model. And I've been involved with a few local organisations for climate change action and regeneration. And God, us poor little individualists in a capitalistic system trying to get together and form consensus and try to keep groups together and be effective over time. And I think that's also a really important place for psychologists on the group process, on conflict resolution, on the mechanisms of collaboration that for generations have been weeded out of us. We've lost so many skills, and I think that's going to be a really important place for us. I'm interested to see that the ABC is about to release a little documentary about the Malakuta community, who is rising up and doing it on their own way. So I'm really looking forward to seeing the mechanisms of that. There's a lot more collaborative communities coming together. They used to be called communes. There's so many different models of that in Australia. And I think that psychologists can also be involved in making those kinds of communal living work well. And the other thing that I've noted with COVID is that people are starting to absolutely love nature and want it and want a relationship with it. And if we have, the more we have that, the more people, individual people have a personal relationship with nature, then the more we're going to be inspired to protect it. That's my rave.
That's fantastic. Thank you. I'm not gonna have any response to that. That's very helpful. Thank you.
Okay, Caroline. You're muted, Caroline.
Thanks very much, George. I really appreciate listening to what you said. And, you know, I think to look at that list that you put down, I mean, you know, COVID has been a global experiment that's revealed all of these things. And because of that, I think it's kind of, I hesitate to double down on my pessimism about what humanity can produce. But I'm reminded of kind of two things from much earlier age. One was these sort of torturous group exercises that some of us were put through, where you have to imagine that you're the only people left on the planet, and you're all together, and the task is to recreate humanity in some way, and how quickly those things went into just horror. You know, how quickly those exercises reproduced, the worst in many ways. And then before that, I was sort of reminded of in a way, the idealism of sci-fi films where an alien or aliens came in, and, you know, all of a sudden, in a way, that kind of made possible for human beings to suspend their differences and realize that they were a species unto themselves and sort of connected in some way, that suddenly there was a collective threat that was actually galvanizing in terms of a sense of what you belong, what you belong to. But I've been looking at number 9, which is sort of my habit to do, and I was wondering about what transformational or transformative responses. And I keep coming back to, what is the possible transformative, transformational sense of belonging that transcends group identity sufficiently to make shared endeavor possible. To make a cooperation on the scale that it would need to be possible. And so that's one thought I have, and I'm also very aware that the pace of change of climate far outstrips the pace of change that humans can change as well. And so what would be, short of the aliens arriving, what might be the impetus that could accelerate our own pace of change? No answer to other questions.
Do you have any answer for that, or is it an open question?
It's an open question that I'm trying to I think it's a better question than you're the only people left on the earth and how are you going to survive and replicate. But it's the generative question that I'm considering.
I really like the way that you put that under number 9, this box of something that we haven't had before, like a moment of awakening, a moment of collective consciousness, and whether such a thing can happen or whether we could anticipate it and we could even encourage it, because we've never had that before. But we've never had the interconnection we have now. So it's like we have never in human history had a sense of our collective identity in the way that we do now. So I think, just as when I said that thing about how hunter-gatherer societies could not possibly imagine living 4 million people in a city, because their relationship with their neighbors was always a fraught or tense one. I'm just wondering about how our mindset is still based on the assumption that maybe we can work collectively, but there's still nation states, there's still different cultures, and maybe but there's actually a point above that where we're all so interconnected we can just say, well, humanity is one thing, and we actually start thinking as one. I don't know, it would be something new, that's for sure.
Okay, well, I'm not sure if we've got any more questions.
Or
Maybe.
points, they don't even have to be questions, they just have to be
points. So, yeah.
Anybody? I'm happy to hear from people if I can put out the question of saying, so of my scenarios, imagine we're going to be say 50 years, you can make it a little longer if you like, 100 years. What do you think is going to be the main one which is going to manifest? And I'm quite open to hearing that it's not the positive one.
Catherine.
I think we're at a crossroads, right? I think we're at a point of choice. I can see collaboration already happening, and I can see conflict already happening. And we're going to have a long period where there's both. And which one wins out, I think, is anybody's guess. I think we're in for all of those in extremity. And it was such a wonderful summary. So I guess that's why I keep focusing on the collaboration and trying to minimize the conflict, because I believe that's the big battle that is going on already. And I look at the people that I know up north in the floods, and they're both furious at being left to their own community to have to respond, but also extremely proud and extremely empowered about how the community has come together. So I think it's the good old battle of human light and dark.
Sally?
Well, I'd echo a lot of what you just said there, Catherine. You put it really well. And I think, yeah, it is our human nature to want to have that dominant narrative, which will say it's going to be this or it's going to be that. But yeah, I only see enormous complexity, and that, yeah, the analogy, flood analogy is a very good one, that there will be both. And clearly, you know, I had the argument around evolution, we need cooperation just as much as we might need competition and conflict to survive and evolve. And so, yeah, I'm sort of buckled down for the ride of all of this happening at the same time, and that, you know, we are at this moral place of we ourselves have to just make that decision to consciously choose for cooperation. And yeah, just that thing on the number 9, the question mark, I had put it down as the miraculous, you know, that we and the miraculous is the sense that we as humans can evolve forms of culture that will be able to negotiate this. Yeah, I think being in the midst of a change of worldview as we are here in Western culture, we can only be incredibly confused.
Yeah. Well, I basically think that if we hit the 4 to 5 degree mark, then large complex societies will collapse. So the future is actually in small scale societies, which will try lots of different methods of survival. And that's evolution in action, is that you have a huge variety of cultural responses to problems, and eventually some of those will be selected as workable in that situation. So yes, so it's I guess the psychological state I would want to encourage in some way is curiosity and relationship to the world. Because without curiosity, you can't do the responding. And so that seems to overcome a lot of the defense mechanism type responses.
Yeah.
That's all.
Yeah. And I think with that goes humility, and that root word that goes back to humus, into earth. And
sorry, think of Lebanese.
Yeah. And you know, how we go with a sort of the form of humbling that is this process, which is, I guess, that other narrative we haven't talked about, which is initiation and rite of passage, which I think is brought up.
I'm sorry, I didn't catch that. Is what?
Rite of passage and initiation, which is another religiosity one, but is again often referred to around all these kind of where we are and so on. That there's.
Oh, it's about transition.
That's right, facing death, being humble,
transition.
the ego having to be relativized, and coming into an understanding which is far greater than the individual one, which is, of course, egotistic one, which has been so promoted within the narcissism of Western culture.
Interesting.
Neoliberalism, yeah. It always ends up being a huge conversation, George.
Super, I love it.
Yeah. So thank you again.
Thank you. Yeah.
Caroline?
Mute.
You're mute, Caroline. You're mute.
Sorry. Sort of one counter cultural, I suppose, tool that I want to offer into number 9 in a way. And it's one that's been with us for a very long time. And I was reminded of it, George, when you were talking about awareness of mortality. And I want to put a good word in for denial, in the sense that I think that it's actually one of the evolved human capacities that makes it possible, once one is aware of one's mortality,
Yes,
actually go on and to carry on. And so there's I'm just wondering about together with all of the destructive capacities that humans have, that kind of wonderful capacity we have to carry on anyway, and to know about this and yet still carry on. And just I see that profoundly as a resource, and don't yet know how, I try to mobilize it when I can, but I just wonder about treating that one not necessarily as an all-in problem, but possibly as a resource.
Thank you. This is very, I really appreciate it. This is very deep thinking, and I really like it. One thought I had I wanted to share with you is that it's possible that collaboration and conflict are not could go together. And I was triggered to think that of talking about the responses of people who have gone through flooding, of coming together very tightly through in their own identity and feeling very angry externally. So there's collaboration in the sense of a kind of human collaboration where we say we're all in this together. But there's also a collaboration which actually I'm really thinking could be very possible, which is that the intense local collaboration that you get between people under extreme weather events could lead to an external facing antagonism. In other words, I wouldn't underestimate the degree to which a tribalism is very, very deep in the human spirit, and that where we work well is where we expand the tribe to include many, many more people within it. But that when we're facing these intense situations which bring us very, very closely together, like, for example, if we could imagine the intense camaraderie which happens between people on the front line in warfare, that makes you actually fight more. So that there could even be so that there's some kind of a correlation there between that. And just whether that couldn't indeed be provoked, a kind of an outward facing antagonism couldn't be provoked by the experience of a collaboration which comes through extreme weather events, say.
Thank you. Catherine, did you have another comment?
Yes, sorry, just quickly. Humility and curiosity are two of my favorite things. And one of the other things that I'm seeing really start to grow in Australia is a much more deep appreciation of Indigenous culture and practices and what it can give us, not just in terms of the actual working with the land, but one of my favorite books is Sand Talk by Tyson Yonka Porter. And that has given me, as a Irish heritage little white girl, such a wonderful window into what it actually means to have a relationship with country, and to the levels of collaboration that are in that book are astonishing. And I really recommend it. I'll pop it in the chat because it's given me a much deeper and wider idea of collaboration between humans and in relationship to the natural world.
Anthony, do you want to comment?
Yes, just briefly. Look, I see that all of those above scenarios will happen in the future, but I do see that there'll only be significant enough level of cooperation if eventually we have what you might call a global village attitude. The thing is, I shudder to think of how we might get to that point because of all the wars that will probably happen in the future, and that will perhaps lead to the breakdown of the nation state. Then maybe, just maybe, sometime in the future, we might have what we all understand we need, and that is global cooperation. But what the state of the world will be in at that stage is, pretty horrifying. That's all.
Did you want to make any response, George, or are you?
No, I'm busy writing down notes from the hive mind. Thank you.
Okay, well, Sally, you wanted to say something.
Yeah, thanks, Catherine, for bringing up Sand Talk. And I just wanted to add to that, around all the cooperative ways that he talks about there. But he also makes it very clear that violence is a part of human life. And he talks in a really interesting way about how in Indigenous cultures, in Australia, there are very specific forms for both recognising violence and their capacity. I mean, one of them saying, yeah, you do it out in public and you do it in ways which are socially constrained and so on. So I think there's some really interesting ideas there. But just, you know, bringing up that Indigenous response and how again I have Indigenous discussions around this, their narrative of resilience, and that from their point of view, climate change has been happening with colonisation. It's been on for a long time. But there is never a wavering. There's not a sort of a falling into a doomsday kind of apocalypticism that's so strong within Western consciousness. It's about assuming a resilience, and we've always been here, and we always will be, and we will have to adapt it, because again there is that sense of relational response to where the world's at, as opposed to a kind of a presumption of we are here to change the world, and we have to either figure out or die in the process of where we've got ourselves to now, is the Western dilemma.
Yeah, I'd also just say something to just a little bit add to what George was saying a bit earlier, that, you know, it's impossible to have serious conflict without cooperation, because you need a group to have serious conflict, and that means that you need the cooperation of the group. So that, you know, that's it. The two are interconnected all the time, though not necessarily, you know, in a bad way.
Okay, well, perhaps Darcy, maybe that will be the last question, perhaps.
No, there's someone else here who wants to speak. I can see several hands up.
Oh, okay, sorry, I couldn't see that. Oh, okay. Well, Darcy anyway, and then there's Anthony again, I think. Yeah. No, just one. Darcy.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, just thinking about the sand talk again, and like one of the things that I took from that book was like the notion of deep time, and maybe this humility that you know, might rise up in us, that there might be something beyond humans. Like I think we've been talking a lot about like the survival of the human species, and that being like part of the fight or the tension here. But I think one of the things that I took from Tyson's book was, I don't know, this sense of peace that something will continue. I don't know how that would show up like across society, or how that would be like a psychological response. But yeah, like maybe it might kind of come into, well, let's enjoy it while we can, or that form of yeah, living the good life. Like we've got this part, something will continue beyond us. Just a thought.
I mean, that goes back to some of the earlier conversation about legacy projects, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, very interesting. Well, I think we've been talking a long time. We've been managing to talk for an hour and a half, and it might be a good time to close down. I just want to say thank you so much, everybody, and it's been such a high level of conversation emerging from this. It's just absolutely wonderful, and thank you, as I said. And I guess one of the things I want to say about the development of this project is, I mean, I see this as being a collaborative project. I mean, I'm going to be going out there and I mean, writing down everything the whole way through. I see this as a way of drawing on a great deal of wisdom, and I want to really get outside. But I'm not interested particularly in talking to climate change people. I want to step outside and just get as much wisdom as possible. And thank you very much for bringing that Indigenous perspective. I think that's very powerful. I think the more that I mean, I go back to the point, but I think that the seeds of what's going to happen are already manifest. I'm just very, very interested to identify them and name them. But I hope that you agree, it seems from the conversation that you do, but the exercise of trying to identify these as distinct conditions helps us to see where we're going. I mean, I guess when I think like, what's the objective of this exercise? The objective for me is that moving forward, people can say, ah, that's that, or that's that, or that's that.
Yeah.
In other words, I'm not going to be doing any new creative thinking on this. I think all of the ideas are already there. But what I'm hoping is to structure them in a way where people can say, well, no, we could have like a year-on-year audit. You know, you could say, well, we're seeing more of that and less of that, and recognize these things are in competition. So one of the ideas, sorry, I am talking a little bit now, but one of the ideas I took from this is one of the people speaking said that there would be, we'll be going through a period where there's a combination of of both conflict and cooperation. I guess the way that I see it is that we're going to be going through a period of the next few years where there's like a collective experimentation in which we're going to be trying out different responses and seeing which one works. And I guess that's why I'd like to name them, so we can say, let's see what's going on here. And we need, I guess, part of what we need to do is not only to create the circumstances whereby one is favored over the other, but actually recognize that's a strategy. Like, we do not want to have a strategy where in this collective experimentation, conflict is rewarded over and above collaboration, say. And I think maybe that way of thinking of the next 30, 40 years as a period of collective psychological experimentation and lots of different people trying different things to see which is the one that responds the best. We need to recognize that process is going along and help to steer it. Anyway, that's my final thought.
Okay, well, just thank you very much indeed, George, for sharing all your thoughts, and thank you everybody else. It's really been a pleasure this evening, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your trip to Australia. And from what you were saying, you're going to be back here again in the not too distant future. So hope that we can catch up with you again.
Thank you. The thing I'm learning very much in Australia, I've been so impressed. I've spoken. I've run. I've had over 20 meetings over the past like 2 weeks. I'm just so inspired by the level of creative thinking and experimentation and ideas which are happening in Australia. I don't think you realize in a global context how creative this place is. You're at the absolute front line of climate change impacts. You're at the front line of the conflicts between resolving the conflicts between the fossil fuel age and the renewables age. There's no country on earth that has a greater conflict between the vested interest and pressure of fossil fuels and the potential of renewables. And I think this is a real place where creative thinking can happen. So, and this conversation is part of that. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
And to you. Thank you to you.
Yeah, thanks very much, George.